Hey, this is Dan, and in this video, I'm going to talk about a section of Main Street in downtown Hartford, Connecticut, just north of Center Church. There are no buildings along this section today, which is just east of Hartford's ancient burying ground. But starting in the late 1700s, buildings were allowed to encroach along this side of the burying ground. Over the years, these buildings included an early schoolhouse, a chapel used by Center Church, and several commercial buildings that once housed some notable Hartford businesses. Among these were a successful African-American daguerreotypist, a lithograph and print company that was a rival of Currier and Ives, a pioneering 20th century restaurant chain, and the very first home of the Hartford Courant, the nation's oldest continuously published newspaper. This photograph is a view northward of the section of downtown Hartford I'll be talking about. Main Street is on the right, and Lewis Street is on the far left. In the center is Hartford's ancient burying ground. In use from 1640 to about 1815, it is the one part of the modern city that really gives a sense of its colonial-era past. There is an entrance to the burying ground on the south side, adjacent to Gold Street, and another entrance on the east side, off of Main Street. Today, the block of Main Street between Gold and Pearl Streets has only two buildings. At the corner of Main and Gold is Center Congregational Church, which was built in 1807. To the north, at the corner of Main and Pearl, is the building complex called One Corporate Plaza. Completed in 1975, it consists of an office tower, known as the Gold Building, behind which is a parking garage that extends westward along Pearl Street. At one time, buildings lined this entire stretch of Main Street, including the now open area between the church and the Gold Building. By the time of this photograph from the early 1880s, there were three buildings in that section of Main Street north of the church. Over time, these buildings would be significantly altered and eventually demolished. North of these three, there were more buildings all the way up to the corner of Pearl Street. These stood where the east side of the Gold Building is today. I'll be talking about them in an upcoming video, so be on the lookout for that. But here I'll be focusing on the area in front of the ancient burying ground. This is a plan of Main Street, Hartford, showing the buildings and occupants at the period of the American Revolution. It's from the antiquarian John Warner Barber's Connecticut Historical Collections, first published in the 1830s. Zooming in to the section of Main on the west side between Gold and Pearl, there were important religious, educational, and business activities going on. The First Society Meeting House, indicated here, refers to the First Congregational Society's church building. The society is actually older than Hartford itself, having been founded in 1632 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 4 years later, in 1636, Reverend Thomas Hooker led the congregation to start the settlement of Hartford. By the time of the Revolution, the society was using its third meeting house, erected in 1739 at the southeast corner of the burying ground. It would be replaced by the current Center Congregational Church building in 1807. North of the meeting house was a school. As William Deloss Love wrote in his 1914 book, The Colonial History of Hartford, quote, "The first or middle district was given liberty in 1771 to erect a schoolhouse on the northeast corner of the burying ground. The building was of brick, 36 feet long north and south, and 22 feet wide. It had a chimney at each end and a partition in the middle. This schoolhouse was sold in 1814, unquote. The district school was then moved to Market Street, where it eventually became the Brown School. North of the school was a 2-story structure, which sat just on the edge of the burying ground and the southern edge of the adjacent home lot of John Haynes Lord. This would have been somewhere near where the southeast corner of the Gold Building is today. For many years, the ground floor of this building was rented by James Mookler, an Irish immigrant who had his barber shop here. As William DeLoss Love writes, quote, "In 1771, when the schoolhouse was located, he was granted liberty to erect an addition to his shop on the burying ground next to Mr. Lord's lot. He was granted 6 feet, and he took about twice that," unquote. In 1769, Mookler advertised his shop as being, quote, "within a stone's throw of the North Meeting House," unquote. The center meeting house or church was then known as the North Meeting House, before another North Congregational Church was built further up Main Street in the 1820s. Mookler must have been an interesting character. In 1768, when he was planning a trip to Europe, he warned his customers to, quote, "make immediate settlement or expect trouble," unquote. This long-vanished building also has an important place in the history of not just Hartford, but the entire country, because it was here, above Mookler's barber shop, that the nation's oldest continuously published newspaper was first printed. From October 29th, 1764, to March 25th, 1765, Thomas Green published the first issues of what is now the Hartford Courant. To identify his place of business, he hung a sign of the heart and crown, a symbol which he soon placed on his publication's masthead, and that still represents the newspaper today. Like Mookler, Green indicated his proximity to the North Meeting House. North of Mookler's shop, on the property of John Haynes Lord, were several small buildings used for shops by Robert Curry, a cabinet maker, Ebenezer Austin, a goldsmith, and William Gove, known as Old Gove, who was a shoemaker. These shops were located where the Gold Building stands today. Let's move forward 100 years from the Revolutionary War to a section of the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford. By this time, the First Society's 4th meeting house building, erected in 1807 and which still exists today, had already been standing for 70 years. North of it were the 3 buildings I'll be talking about for the rest of this video. This photograph from 1904 shows Center Church, which was just north of a recently widened Gold Street. North of the church, and just in front of what's now the entrance to the ancient burying ground, was a building erected in the early 1800s that the church acquired and renovated to become its Sunday school and chapel in 1831. The church rented out the building's ground floor for stores and had its chapel and lecture room above. The church used this building for nearly 80 years until the opening of the Center Church House at the corner of Gold, Wells, and Lewis Streets in 1909. After that, the church continued to rent out the Main Street building and get income from it. The front of the building had been considerably remodeled by the time of this photograph of the Memorial Day Parade in 1943. The following year, the church received an offer to buy the building for $150,000. The church refused, and instead, plans were begun to tear the building down in order to restore the Main Street entrance to the ancient burying ground. At the time, the church could not afford to immediately demolish the building, so there was a 6-year effort to raise funds that would equal the rejected purchase offer of $150,000. This way, the church could eventually demolish the building and through investments offset the lost rental income as well. The largest contribution to this fund was a $75,000 bequest from attorney Edward M. Day, who died in 1947. His will stipulated that within 2 years of his death, the project must be assured of completion. The building was finally demolished in 1950 after the last leases had expired. The land was also transferred to the city of Hartford, which undertook the landscaping that would complete the project. Let's turn to a picture of a much earlier parade from the late 1870s or early 1880s. The building I've just been talking about is on the left. Next to it, on the north, were 2 mid-19th century buildings that were located just south of where the Gold Building stands today. Of these 2, the 4-story building on the left was later raised to 5 stories, as shown in the picture on the right. This building was located on the site where the old schoolhouse, in use until 1814, had stood. By 1880, the building contained offices of the Weed Sewing Machine Company. Another notable Hartford business occupied the building's south store from about 1883 until 1927. This was the catering company of P&J Bess, later called Bess & Company, which was known for its ice cream and pastries. The company later moved further south on Main Street and then to West Hartford's center in the 1930s. In November of 1894, it opened a fine dining restaurant in the adjacent retail space, but this closed after just 4 months. George J. Loeffler's German drugstore then moved in, which had previously occupied space at the corner of Main and Grove Streets. This is a photograph of the interior of the store. Just to the north was a narrower building that in the mid-1800s was home to Kellogg Brothers, lithographers, and printmakers. They were second only to Currier and Ives in their commercial success in the 19th century. From 1830 onwards, the Kellogg's had several successive partnerships formed among themselves and with others, including from 1871 with William H. Bulkley, brother of the famous Hartford politician Morgan G. Bulkley. By that time, the company had moved to Pearl Street, and early in the 20th century, it would move again to Franklin Avenue. Other tenants of the Kellogg Building, circa 1850, were the Mercantile Bank and the studio of Augustus Washington, an African-American daguerreotypist. He had opened his first Daguerrean gallery in 1846, and he moved into the Kellogg Building the following year. This advertisement is from 1852. Washington had a successful business and included among his customers some of Hartford's most prominent citizens. He eventually decided to close shop in 1853, and he and his family moved to Liberia. On March 29, 1853, he placed a notice in the Hartford Courant that read, in part, quote, The subscriber begs leave to announce to the citizens of Hartford and the public generally that he has completed his arrangements for closing up his business in the early part of next fall. And while with gratitude he must acknowledge his complete success in this department of art and the kind and liberal patronage of a discerning public the last 7 years, it may be proper to say that he shall retire from business at the above time, not for a want of any further success or patronage, but for the purpose of foreign travel, and to mingle in other scenes of activity and usefulness." Unquote. In Liberia, Washington was an active businessman and politician, serving in the Liberian House of Representatives and Senate. By the early 20th century, these two buildings had become known as the Quinn and Landman buildings, based on their most recent owners. In 1905, there was an interesting court case when the owners of the Landman building were sued by the city for allegedly encroaching on the ancient burying ground. This was due to the construction of a veranda on the rear of their building. The case was argued before Judge Edwin B. Gager of the Superior Court. As the Hartford Courant reported on March 29, 1905, quote, "Before the map of the locality had been laid in evidence, Judge Gager asked if the cemetery mentioned was the one near Main Street. He was told that it was, and then he asked on what side of the cemetery the encroachment was. Counsel for the city said that it was on the east side, but that a map of the locality would be submitted. Judge Gager said he asked the questions as he was somewhat familiar with the location of the cemetery. His room at the Hubline Hotel overlooks it, he said." Unquote. The hotel was located at the corner of Gold and Wells Streets, just southwest of the burying ground. The land where the Landman building stood had originally been a portion of the burying ground granted by the town of Hartford to Charles Hopkins in deeds dated to 1786 and 1793. To settle the case required an extensive investigation of early Hartford records. As the Courant later reported, quote, "The hearing developed into a session of historical research and was largely attended by those interested in the early history of Hartford." Unquote. In 1910, both the Quinn and Landman buildings were acquired by John Porter and his partner Curtis R. Blanchard of Worcester. 2 years later, Porter and Blanchard acquired from Center Church the rights to the gangway that ran between the south wall of the Quinn building and the north wall of Center Church's rental building. About 20 years before, this gangway had been covered over and occupied by a succession of businesses, most recently by Cox's Cigar Store. The partners Porter and Blanchard ran the Capital Lunch System, an early chain of lunchroom restaurants. Born in Hebron, Connecticut in 1873, John Porter opened his first lunchroom in 1902 in the old Kellogg building on the right. As I mentioned, this was later called the Landman Building. He soon began to expand both in Hartford and beyond, and by 1915 he had 20 lunchrooms open in cities like Waterbury and New Haven, Connecticut, Springfield and Worcester, Massachusetts, Portland, Maine, and even a 2-floor location on Broadway in New York City that could seat 400 people. In 1920, however, Porter shifted his focus from restaurants to real estate. The Capital Lunch locations were taken over by the Waldorf system, a rival chain that had been started in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1903. The Waldorf system was firmly based in modern efficiency. The company carefully calculated food portions at central commissaries. In 1928, the Hartford Board of Health discovered that the company was preparing hot foods such as roasts, soups, and stews at its commissary in Springfield, and then shipping them out still hot to its Hartford locations for reheating. At the insistence of the board's superintendent, Dr. Charles P. Botsford, this practice, which involved about 1/4 of the food prepared for the chain's Hartford restaurants, was discontinued, with all food thereafter to be prepared on site. No one had ever actually been sickened by the transported food, however, and to forestall any bad publicity, the company ran an advertisement that declared, quote, "Board of Health calls Waldorf lunchroom excellent. Health Board Superintendent declares he never intended to intimate otherwise, and food inspections have always shown high-quality product," unquote. In 1929, the old Kellogg building that had more recently housed Waldorf Lunch was replaced with a much shorter two-story building designed in the Colonial Revival style by the J.M. Gray Company of Boston. Waldorf Lunch would continue in the new building for a few years further. In 1960, the building was remodeled for a pharmacy. At some point, the building to the south that had once housed Bess's Catering lost its upper 2 stories. By the early 1970s, the businesses on the ground floor were an A&M store and a White Tower restaurant. In 1973, the buildings to the north were all demolished to make way for the construction of the Gold Building. These 2 old buildings held on for a decade longer until they were themselves demolished in 1983. Notice that the old single-story section that had begun as a gangway was later covered over and then been acquired by John Porter from Center Church in 1912, was still attached to the south side of the building. When these buildings were finally demolished, the space between Center Church and the Gold Building in front of the ancient burying ground was completely clear of buildings for the first time since the early 18th century. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button and also the subscribe button. And please tell anyone you know who you think might enjoy my content about my channel. I thank you for watching.